Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the 18th World Conference on Tobacco or Health webinar series. During our webinar today, we will discuss plain packaging lessons from the next round of implementing countries. Before we get started, I would like you to go over a few features that will allow you to take part in today's event. When joining the webinar, you will prompt to set up your audio. By default, the platform selects your computer's mic and speakers. If you prefer joining over the telephone, please select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Please note that you are joining in a listen-only mode, which means that you are muted throughout the webinar. However, during our session, you will have the opportunity to engage with our panelists by submitting your text questions in the questions pane. You may send them at any time during the presentation. We will collect and address these questions during the Q&A segment at the end of our panelists' presentations. Now, without further ado, I am pleased to welcome our webinar moderator, Mr. Mark Goodchild, who is an economist working in the Health Promotion Department of the World Health Organization's Geneva office. Originally from New Zealand, Mark has been with WHO for 15 years, including being stationed in the country office for India and the regional office for Southeast Asia. In his current position, Mark's main responsibility is to help countries raise tobacco taxes and prices. This has meant working closely with Ministry of Finance and Health, colleagues from many countries across the world, and publishing research covering the economics of tobacco and taxation. Welcome, Mark, and it's over to you.
Thank you, Joanna, and welcome everyone. This webinar is organised by the Union and the 18th World Conference on Tobacco or Health, the Scientific Track Committees for Demand Reduction. I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers for today's session, Ms. Suzanne Zhou, Professor Joanna Cohen, and Professor Prickett. Our first speaker, Suzanne, is Manager for Prevention at the McCabe Centre for Law and Cancer. Her work focuses on supporting countries to adopt and defend laws and policies to prevent NCDs, and also to promote policy coherence between health and international economic law. Suzanne has previously worked for the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health and for the Lawyers Collective. She holds an LLM from Cambridge, an LLB from the University of Melbourne, and the diploma from La Hague Academy of International Law. The topic of Suzanne's presentation today is Lessons from a Decade of Legal Challenges to Plain Packaging. Suzanne, thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mark, and it's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to everyone from here from Melbourne, Australia. I'm going to talk about one of the reasons it's a good time to talk about the next round of implementing countries for plain packaging. And one of those reasons is that in June this year, the World Trade Organization's appellate body dismissed the last remaining challenge to Australia's plain packaging laws. This decision ends a decade of litigation with a comprehensive win for public health, and with no more pending legal challenges, and in particular no more pending trade and investment law challenges, it paves the way for more countries to move ahead with plain packaging. So I'm going to be talking about plain packaging litigation both in Australia and in other countries that have moved ahead with this a very important public health measure, and I'll examine what we might take from this moving forward. So I'll start by just briefly explaining what plain packaging is. You can see here there's a picture of what tobacco packs look like in Australia. And effectively, the plain packaging laws are a measure to standardise the appearance of packs. So they require packs to be in a standard shape, colour, font with a brand and variant in plain text, and they prohibit anything that's really kind of outside of those prescribed appearances. So they prohibit images, colors, textures, promotional text, anything that's really kind of used to promote the pack. They're accompanied by graphic health warnings, which in Australia cover 75% of the front and 90% of the back of the pack. And these are really complementary measures. So the aim of plain packaging is to prevent the pack from being used as promotion by standardizing those elements of the design of the pack. To make the graphic health warnings more effective by preventing tobacco companies from designing in ways that downplay the graphic health warnings, and also to prevent misleading pack design because they are all in a standard size and shape and color and so forth. So plain packaging is recommended under the guidelines to Article 11 on packaging and labelling and Article 13 on a comprehensive ban on tobacco advertising, promotion and sponsorship under the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And it's also one of the World Health Organization's best buys for non-communicable disease prevention and control. So Australia was the first country in the world to implement tobacco plain packaging. And, oh, has my screen gone? No, there it is. The tobacco industry really vociferously opposed it. So there was both a wider political campaign with your standard kind of front groups, you know, political campaigns, misinformation and so forth to oppose plain packaging. But notably, there was also really scorched earth litigation tactics. So Australia faced three branches of litigation. So one was a constitutional court challenge that was brought by the major tobacco companies in Australia, which was won by the government by the Australian government in 2012. There was also an investor-state dispute that was brought by Philip Morris Asia, which is the Hong Kong regional headquarters of Philip Morris companies, and that was also decided in favour of Australia in 2015. And then there was a WTO dispute, which was brought by several WTO members. So initially Ukraine, Dominican Republic, Honduras, Cuba, and Indonesia. Later, Ukraine dropped out, and on appeal, it was Honduras and the Dominican Republic. And reportedly, the complainants were supported by the tobacco industry to bring this dispute. So there was really quite a lot of litigation. The WTO dispute at the panel level concluded in 2018, and then, of course, only this year only this year did the appeal finish for a measure that was passed Parliament in 2011 and where the packs have been on shelves since 2012. And we see a similar kind of story with really aggressive litigation elsewhere as well, so in the countries that followed Australia. So for example, in the United Kingdom, there was also litigation before the High Court and then also appealed to the Court of Appeal. Leave to appeal further than that was denied. Again, that challenge was rejected by the courts, and the United Kingdom won that challenge, and plain packaging was upheld. In France, litigation in the Constitutional Council and the State Council again decided in favour of France. In Norway, there was litigation in a district and appeal court, and in Ireland there was also a case which was referred to the European Court of Justice, and it ended when there were when related European Court of Justice proceedings upheld the relevant aspects of EU law. Each of these cases is quite large and complex in its own right. But for our purposes and for the purposes of a short presentation here, I want you to think of these as really having two prongs, two kind of, I guess, broad categories of legal arguments. And so one of them is really about trying to frame plain packaging not as a health issue, but as an issue of property, and in particular intellectual property. And that's something that you see as in the WTO in terms of the International Intellectual Property treaties, which including the WTO's TRIPS agreement and various treaties that are incorporated under that. It's one that you see in investment law context as in the claims that plain packaging expropriates trademarks, which, of course, an unsuccessful argument. And it's also one that you see when a lot of those constitutional property protections are invoked. And that's really about trying to reframe the issue as being one of property rather than being one of health. And then the other set of arguments are really arguments where the industry really tries to challenge and undermine the evidence. And so there's various provisions in the WTO. There's provisions about measures not being more trade restrictive than necessary for legitimate objective. In investment law, fair and equitable treatment, different kinds of proportionality arguments in other forums. And for this one, they're quite diverse areas of law legally, but what they have in common is that they involve an assessment of the evidence. And so often a lot of this litigation is really about, putting up a challenge to the evidence and really trying to attack it in that way. So those are kind of the two broad categories of legal strategy in this litigation. And that's characteristic of this litigation, but of course it's not limited to that, and it's not really a new thing. So I have here an excerpt from an industry document from the Tobacco Institute of New Zealand in 1993, and it's a memo and from one from I guess the Tobacco Institute saying, any initiative affecting cigarette packs, be it for larger warnings, repositioned warnings, declaration of constituents, more space for consumer information, inserts quit information, or a progression towards plain packs should not be contested as a health issue, a children's smoking issue, or a consumer information issue. It should be treated as expropriation of intellectual property and contested politically on that basis. So, from 1993, you can see this kind of strategy taking place. And of course, I don't need to tell the tobacco control community about the industry's role in kind of seeding doubt about the evidence. So really, this kind of litigation should be seen as part of that broader legal strategy. But what I want you to take away from this presentation is that the industry strategy was not successful. We've seen a comprehensive victory for public health, 4 out of 4 cases, if you count the appeal as a separate case, in favour of Australia, so wins all around. Also wins for public health in the UK, France, and Norway, a win in the European Court of Justice that also resolved the challenge in Ireland. And for this most recent decision in the WTO appellate body, that's actually very significant because the appellate body is effectively the appeals court for the multilateral trading system. And although it's not technically binding, but on anyone other than the countries that were party to the dispute, in practice, WTO dispute settlement panels tend to be fairly consistent in the way they interpret provisions. And so this is actually really confirmation of how you should interpret the relevant provisions of the WTO agreements, and they have a lot of weight for all 168 WTO members. So that's a really significant multilateral decision, and it's a comprehensive victory for public health as well. So the key things the WTO appellate body has said in its recent decision: 1, it finds that plain packaging measures are apt to and do in fact make a meaningful contribution to public health, so they work. the plain packaging measures don't restrict trade more than necessary to achieve their public health objective. Effectively, the panel and appellate body said that to the extent that it restricts trade, it's because it's effective. And so, you know, it's not more than necessary. It is necessary to protect public health. And then finally, they say a lot of important things about intellectual property rights, and they really affirm that they don't prevent regulation of marketing in order to protect public health. One of the arguments, which is a bit technical, was about kind of the nature of the trademark. The appellate body and panel found that a trademark is a negative right, and so it only grants you rights to prevent other people from copying your trademark. It doesn't actually grant you rights to bring a case against the government effectively, or to use it in marketing, or to be exempt from regulation. So that's kind of one of the more technical points. And there are also a lot of really important statements recognizing regulatory autonomy for public health, in particular in relation to some of the intellectual property obligations under the WTO. So the key lessons from this case are, one is that intellectual property doesn't prevent the state from regulating marketing and promotion of a harmful product, that commercial rights and the rights of the private sector are not absolute, and there's very good grounds to restrict them for public health reasons. On a practical note, it shows some of the importance of multi-sectoral coordination and that commitment when you're the first country to do something bold. But I think the most important lesson of all is don't be intimidated. With a measure like plain packaging and other tobacco control measures, the science of public health is on your side. And I think one of the lessons to take from this, the experience of the litigation, is that the law is also on your side. So thank you very much. Yeah, and feel free to get in contact if you have further questions. And with that, I will hand to the other panelists.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, for a really excellent overview of a big issue. It's impressive that the Australian plain packaging rules have overcome, you know, every legal challenge basically. Now it's part of the global legal framework. So I look forward to talking to you again in the Q&A session. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce Professor Joanna Cohen. Joanna is Bloomberg Professor of Disease Prevention and Director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Joanna has been involved in tobacco policy research for over 20 years now, trained in epidemiology and health policy. Joanna's focuses on factors that affect the adoption of public health policies, evaluating their benefits and unintended consequences of those policies. Dr. Cohen is also Deputy Editor of the journal Tobacco Control. Joanna will present the experiences and lessons from introducing plain packaging in Australia and other countries around the world. Thank you, Joanna. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm delighted. And let me share my screen again. Oopsie. Let's see. Joanna, can you just send that reminder again? Let's just see. Let's see. Do you see my screen now?
No, we don't.
There we go. Thank you. That should work. Let me move that. Is that better? Do you have it now?
I think that looks good, Joanna, yes.
Okay, super, thank you. All right, so as Mark said, I'm going to talk about the experiences and lessons learned from countries that have introduced plain packaging already. And I just want to begin with some acknowledgements. First, Michael Iacobelli from the Institute for Global Tobacco Control, who helped put together this presentation. I also want to thank experts from the countries that have already implemented plain packaging and researchers who've been doing cutting edge work related to plain packaging. All their insights have been extremely helpful for, and we've drawn on those for this presentation. So this is a map of the world, and it shows countries that have implemented or are about to implement plain and standardized packaging. As of today, 17 countries have finalized requirements for plain packaging. 14 countries in dark green have full implementation of plain packaging at the retail level. So the plain packs are on the shelves. There are other countries in sort of the medium green color that have all the laws adopted but are pending full implementation. That's Belgium, Hungary, and the Netherlands. And then in the light green, a bit hard to see, a couple of countries that have laws that are adopted but they're waiting on regulations. That's Georgia and Romania. And then many more countries have laws that are pending full implementation or being formally considered. All right, and so there are similarities and differences in terms of the types of tobacco products that are covered by a country's plain packaging requirements. So this table has rows for each of the 14 countries that already have plain packs required on the shelves. And you can see that they all cover cigarettes and tobacco pouches or packs of roll your own tobacco. A majority of the countries require plain packs for cigars and cigarillos. Some cover smokeless tobacco, and so far only Israel requires plain packs for e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products. So the plain pack dimensions required by countries vary across the country. And this sort of forest plot shows sort of the range of sizes that a country requires for plain packs. At the top sort of country we have is Australia. The orange line represents the range of widths that the pack can take on, and the blue line next to it shows the range of heights that the pack can take on. So countries generally allow for a range, and you can see just by looking at this graph that there are differences across the country. And whereas, let's say, Australia has quite a wide range of heights, if you go down to the bottom line, Uruguay, that has a much smaller, just 10 millimeter difference in the range of heights that are allowed. All right, we also see differences in terms of the pack edges. So Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Singapore require those, perpendicular straight edge packs, the straight edges. France, the UK, Ireland, Saudi Arabia, and Slovenia allow rounded or beveled edges. They don't have to have straight edges. So that makes the pack certainly a bit more interesting to consumers. We also see that the stick count and the weight for roll your own tobacco vary. So many countries do specify a minimum stick count of 20. New Zealand allows either 20 or 25 cigarette sticks per pack. France, UK, Norway, and Ireland have a minimum weight for their tobacco pouches, and New Zealand has, a couple of weights that are allowed. These are just pictures of packs that were purchased in Uruguay showing a 10-stick pack and a 20-stick pack of the same brand. We also see differences in the font and color. However, every country is using the same background color for the pack, the main background color, the Pantone 448C, which Australia did tons of research on. So that's the background color, but there Each country does provide a specific font size, font style, the typeface and color for the brand name. So the font size does vary in terms of size from 8 to 14 points so far. The color of that font for the brand name can vary, and the font type itself can be different. There's also a range of brand names. So right now, most countries do allow color descriptors within a brand or variant name. So here we see packs from France, going from left to right. So we have France, Ireland, and New Zealand, and you can see, Virginia Gold, Marlboro Gold, Winfield Select Red. So there are colors within the names. I do want to point out that Uruguay, a number of years ago, instituted a very innovative policy for single pack presentation, which forced a tobacco company, to choose only one brand variant of each brand that they could sell in the country. So you could not have Marlboro Red, Marlboro Gold, Marlboro Black, Marlboro Green, Marlboro Menthol. You had to choose one. So just Marlboro, they went with red, but here we see the pack from Uruguay with just the Marlboro name on it. I wish many more countries would follow Uruguay's lead with this, because it helps to move towards this sort of generic packaging idea and taking away other attractive features such as these color names or concept names that companies have been putting on the packs. So, as you know, the tobacco industry will take advantage of loopholes whenever they can. So there's documentation that they've been adding free cigarette sticks to cigarette packs. They can use a lower weight of roll your own tobacco to try to communicate that there's more value. They've used rounded and beveled edges. They've used brand names with color and concept descriptors. They promote the tobacco products that don't require plain packaging. And we've also been seeing a proliferation of flavor capsule variants. So the pictures here on the slides are not plain packs. They're not from the countries that have plain packaging, but it shows, the very attractive and appealing branding that companies are doing around flavor capsules, having multiple capsules in a stick or in a pack. And although they can't do all this fancy, colorful branding, they can still, countries still do allow the capsules, many of these countries. All right. And so Suzanne has also very well described tobacco industry strategies to oppose plain packaging, particularly litigation. Of course, they also use lobbying, including with third-party front groups. They do public relations and media campaigns, drawing on the idea of a nanny state and the idea that, well, it's not going to stop with cigarettes, it's going to move on to, alcohol and candy and snacks and that sort of thing. So sort of inciting fear. And they've threatened all kinds of things, including plant closures within a country. They have threatened an explosion of illicit trade of tobacco products, and they have threatened that there's going to be more stealing from stores, because with plain packaging, it might be harder for the retailer to identify the pack that the consumer wants, and so it takes them longer to find it, and that might leave more time for stealing. And all of these threats have been debunked. So as Suzanne said, we're ready for the next wave of countries to implement plain packaging. We have to keep in mind, though, just like with any tobacco control measure, it needs to be part of a comprehensive tobacco policy strategy. There's no one silver bullet. Everything works together to create synergy and have the most impact. And so the legal challenges against plain packaging have been unsuccessful, as Suzanne laid out. There are many resources available to you, including plain packaging evidence summaries that you can use to make the case in your country. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. It's also important to work with lawyers and others who have experience with plain packaging legislation in their countries to ensure that your legislation and regulations are as strong as possible and that any potential loopholes are minimized, because we know if it's not the strongest legislation, if there's room for loopholes, the tobacco industry is going to take advantage and you're not going to have the impact that you're hoping for. So again, there are many resources available. This is a report that the Institute for Global Tobacco Control just released, and it contains recommendations and steps that can be taken to advance plain and standardized packaging in your country. The report is currently available in English as well as Spanish and Portuguese. And there is a whole range, as I said, of other resources and references that are available to you. I know you can't read all this now, but the slides will be made available after the webinar, and you can draw on these and other important resources. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joanna, for another excellent presentation. And you really highlighted how rapid the adoption has been of plain packaging in just 10 years, and also the kind of resources and support that countries can have. I'm sure people will come back on that issue, on that question during the Q&A. So I look forward to seeing you again shortly. Now I'd like to introduce our final presenter, Dr. Praket. Dr. Praket has over 30 years experience as a tobacco control advocate and has a long service in the Thai government as tobacco control advisor. He's been involved in all aspects of tobacco control, really: advocacy, policy, regulation, and enforcement. He's also former dean of the prestigious medical school of Mahidol University. And I just want to add that a notable achievement during his work is his help to establish the Thai Health Promotion Foundation in 2001. This is a statutory state agency with a budget of 2% on alcohol and tobacco excise taxes, which goes towards funding health promotion. Dr. Praket will present on Thailand's experience in introducing plain packaging, lessons for other low and middle income countries. Thank you, Dr. Praket. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark, and it's a pleasure to join this webinar. Thailand has placed very important on the graphic health warning. Graphic health warning is effective, and we do not have to pay the industry. We just pass the law. The industry will have to do it. So we were the 4th country to have graphic health warning in 2004. But by 2010, we already falling behind. The Uruguay implemented 80% size graphic health warning, and Australia adopted the plain packaging regulation in late 2011. So for Thailand, the choice then was either to go for a bigger graphic health warning or plain packaging. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So at the same time, 2011, we started to drafting process for the revision of Tobacco Product Control Act 1992 to include a provision that will allow us to implement plain packaging, but without a word, no wording on plain packaging, because at that state, plain packaging is a word no in Thailand, because it will face with the opposition from the tobacco industry and including many legislatures. So the wording in our provision for plain packaging says cigarette package in color, health warning, trademark sign, and logo must conform with MOH regulation. And next. Next slide, please. So we started the process of public hearing for the draft bill, and there was strong opposition by tobacco industry, specifically Philip Morris and their fund group, and alleged that there's violation of trademark and intellectual property right, and there were concerns expressed by our Ministry of Commerce because of the trade issue. Next, please. Next, please. So in 2013, Australia's plain packaging regulation was brought to WTO for dispute settlement. So we know that this is going to be a long process. So the Ministry of Health changed their strategy to using the existing law to issue regulation to increase the size of graphic warning from 55 to 85%, while we are waiting for the outcome of the case in WTO. And the tobacco industry challenged the 85% graphic health warning regulation to Thailand Administrative Court, claiming it's unlawful. Next. Next slide, please. So after 1 year, the Administrative Court upheld the 85% graphic health warning, and these are the pictures. So even the so big 85%, they still oppose the plain packaging for the 15 remaining packed surface area. Next, please. So between 2013 and 2014, we will continue to advocate for the draft tobacco control bill, which include a provision on the plain packaging. So the December 2014, the draft tobacco control bill was presented to the cabinet. Now we have to promise the cabinet that we will not implement plain packaging regulation if WTO rule against Australia. Because of this, they're afraid of the case in WTO. It delayed the cabinet approval for the draft bill. And so in May 2015, the cabinet approved bill and sent it for the Judicial Council deliberation. Next, please. So then came May 2016. France and UK already require plain packaging by law, and in the same month, the World No Tobacco Day, UN Secretary General said for country to get ready for plain packaging. We believe this is a very strong signal that the WTO will rule in favor of Australia. Otherwise, the UN would not issue this urging country to go to plain packaging. At the same time, WHO, they released a document guiding plain packaging implementation, evidence, science, and how to implement it. So with that, with all this evidence, we were able to convince the Parliament to approve the new Tobacco Product Control Act with the plain packaging provision in it. Next, please. Next slide, please. So the point of advocacy in the case of Thailand is that plain packaging is a recommendation by the FCTC, Article 11, Article 13, and is a Thailand's obligation. Now, plain packaging is also ruled to be lawful by the Australian court, and the EU Tobacco Control Directive recommend plain packaging, and a signal from from the UN that plain packaging will be positively ruled by the WTO. And then court case in many countries where plain packaging has been implemented before Thailand, such as France and UK. Next slide, please. The timeline takes so long for 6-7 years for the journey of the bill. And the tobacco industry and the front group lobby against the bill in every step of the journey of the bill, draft bill. Next, please. So when in June 2018, the WTO ruled in favor of Australia plain packaging. So we started in the same month, we started to draft the regulation. It's not difficult because the guideline from the campaign for tobacco-free kit is very useful. You just go step by step in following that toolkit. And then we presented to the National Committee to approve the plain packaging bill. We gave the industry 9 months or 270 days to implement the plain pack. Next, please. So these are the plain packaging packet in Thailand. It still maintain the 85% graphic health warning and with 15% remaining area. Next. Next, please. So in conclusion, Thailand's experience in plain packaging regulations that we use the FCTC recommendation guideline. Another country example for advocacy, specifically Australia, we were working very closely with the McCabe Center, Law Center, and then counteraction to the industry opposition. Their argument and their strategy is all the same. It's very important to stress here that it's not difficult to draft plain packaging regulation. It's not difficult, even though I think a lot of people reluctant to go to it because feeling is the technicality of drafting the regulation, which is not difficult. In the case of Thailand, once WTO ruled that Australia's plain packaging was lawful, there were no industry resistance. They cannot make any argument that they have argued before the WTO ruling. So I would like to urge all other countries, especially those who already had graphic health warning, to go for plain packaging. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Prackett. Really insightful presentation from country experience. And you know, Thailand's always been a sort of a global leader in tobacco control, so doing this plain packaging work sort of true to form. I was just wondering if you had any insights, if I may ask you a question, regarding industry interference in Thailand for plain packaging. Now, was the government lobbied heavily? And what was
yes. Yeah, the government, is lobbied very heavily. That's why it takes so many years. Okay, it's at the cabinet level, at the judicial level, and at the parliament level. And then if WTO has not ruled in favor of Australia, we will not get the plain packaging because the government needs the assurance that they will not be taken to legal action by the tobacco industry. But it is really a very heavy battle for the several years, and it's taken my time. But I think for now, these are non-issue. You know, I think country can go for plain packaging, and the tobacco industry, they cannot make any argument anymore that violation international law, trade law, intellectual property right. It's just a matter of political will that your policymaker would like to go for plain packaging. And then as Professor Joanna Cohen had mentioned, that you have many resources, many experts globally to help you draft the plain packaging regulation, and you should not hesitate and should go for the plain packaging. Yes.
Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Prackett, and I'd like to thank all of our panelists again. We're now going to move to answer some questions that have been submitted. And please note there's still time to submit your questions via the question pane. I think maybe I start with our first question to our first presenter, Suzanne. We received a question whether after the WTO decision, does it mean that the industry cannot use similar arguments to what they did in the Australian case?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a couple of levels. So at the WTO itself, it's not technically binding on the other countries that didn't take part in the case, but in practice, really, it's fairly consistent. Panels will follow what previous panels and the appellate body have said, unless they have a really good reason not to. So it would be very, very unlikely that any future WTO decision would decide it differently. I think also as a forum of countries, it's quite, I think, diplomatically difficult for another country to bring a case, because you'd burn a lot of political capital doing that. It's not really a forum. I mean, it's not a forum for industry, it's a forum for WTO member states. So that's the WTO itself. I think WTO, what's also quite significant about the WTO decision is that a lot of countries base their domestic laws on the WTO agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, and depending on whether or not your country's domestic law is interpreted in line with that, it may also make it a lot more difficult for the industry to bring that challenge at the domestic level too. Effectively the industry has much more difficult time using similar arguments. Yeah.
And Suzanne, while I have you on here, I'm interested in your view about the kind of sequencing. Is that a relevant consideration in law?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the decisions have really emphasized, as Joanna said, that plain packaging is part of a comprehensive suite of measures. They have placed some significance on the fact that it's an extension of in particular an advertising ban. But I think it's not something that's really been explicitly addressed. I think that if you did want to bring in a whole comprehensive suite of measures at once, you wouldn't necessarily need to do them one at a time or anything like that. So yeah, I think it is important to have it as part of a comprehensive suite of measures, also just because it's meant to be complementary with other things like graphic health warnings and your general advertising ban. I guess I can't, I'm not sure in terms of the legal considerations how much of a difference that makes. So
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. I also had questions coming through for Joanna. And we have similar interests in terms of evaluation and assessing impact. I'm just wondering if through your review of these countries, whether there have been studies yet of the size effect or the impact of plain packaging. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. I think you're on mute.
Thank you. We have the most experience with Australia because plain packaging has been in effect since the end of 2012, as Suzanne said. So there have been studies showing impact and showing reductions in smoking over time. For the other countries, it's still a bit early. But with all of tobacco control measures, what we expect is them to have an impact on social norms over time, right? So it changes the whole context and how people think about using what these products are, how they think about the tobacco industry. And these shifts, take time, and it allows the new generations to grow up in a completely different environment than the older generations. So people like me have seen the beautiful colored packs, so appealing, all the different shapes and sizes. And then my kids are going to see a very generic pack, and it's just not going to be as appealing. So there has been evidence from Australia showing some impacts, and I just expect that research to grow over time and that the impact continues to continue to occur as time progresses.
Thank you. And from my perspective, I agree with you. I can see that there are a lot of synergies that are possible here, especially when you think the relationship between taxation, price, and plain packaging, which kind of changed the perceived value of the perceived quality of the pack. And I saw in Australia that they implemented plain packaging at the same time as introducing a tax increase. So you can see this effect sort of getting bigger, I'd hope.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I think the other synergy in addition to tax would be restricting flavors. I think that would also help with the names and the appeal of the product inside.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we have answered really the questions that the main ones have come through.
Comment about
yes,
the effective of plain packaging. If you look at the other side, the harder the industry approach some measure, it means that is important, effective. I mean, the so-called the scream test. This is the extreme of the scream test. Now, if you introduce some intervention and they say, this is not good, not everything, and then that is it. Okay. The next step, they will lobby to block, okay, the legislation. If they fail, then they take you to the court, okay. And then they take you to the dispute settlement. So if you look at the effort, the industry is try to bring down the plain packaging regulation. You know that it's going to be an effective, and it will be damaging to the product, to the denormalize the packs. I like the word denormalizing the pack, and then yes, it becomes the one unique product that have this kind of packaging. Okay, so it is effective. Yeah.
Yes, yes, and for us, we have very strong traditional empower measures, but I think if we want to achieve our global goals, whether that's the Sustainable Development Goals or the NCD Global Action Plan, we really need some of these new innovations to create greater impact. So it's really excellent to see plain packaging starting to be implemented throughout the world. I think this is a good time for me to close the session. So I'd like to finish by thanking all the speakers, Suzanne, Joanna, and Dr. Prackett. I really appreciate your time and efforts today. I'd also like to thank Joanna Ward, who is at the helm as our controller, as well as the union for organising this event. Finally, I'd also like to thank the chairs of the TRAP Committee on Demand Reduction. That's Shane, Fenton, and Krishna. So they spent a lot of time putting this theme together and sorting us all out. So thank you for that. I think I will now hand over to Joanna to formally close the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending today's webinar, organized by the Union and the 18th World Conference on Tobacco or Health Scientific and Track Committees. At the end of the session, you will receive a survey. Please don't hesitate to complete it because your feedback is important to us. The recording of this webinar will be available on the Union's YouTube channel. Registrants will receive an email with the link of the recording. It will also be available on the Tobacco-Induced Diseases website landing page. TID will communicate on that through their social media channels. Don't forget to visit our website, www.wctoh.org, and register to our newsletter to stay updated on our various activities. Thank you.